An apocalypse resulting in a frozen world. A scenario more and more developers seem to discover for their projects. After Icy, Frostpunk, Metro Exodus and Fate to Silence, there's also Wasteland 3 moving into frosty territory. In this classical turn-based RPG, we are now leaving the searing deserts of Arizona from the first two games and are moving north with our desert rangers to bring order to the icy cold Colorado. The game is made by inXile, a group of developers around the veteran Brian Fargo, who already was one of the developers responsible for the first Wasteland in 1988. While Wasteland 2 had been financed via Kickstarter, bringing quite some popularity to the platform, Wasteland 3 had been funded via Feek, where they gathered $3.1 million for the game in 2016. In 2018, inXile was sold to Microsoft, which probably is to thank for some more time and money to develop the game, likely being the cause for the postponement. Finally, on the 27th of August 2020, the game had been released.
Stay and you die alone.
Now, around 80 hours later, but in that time I pretty much did everything possible, I finished the game and it's finally time for the review and conclusion. Let's start with the story. While the game is set in the same world as in the previous games, a world after a nuclear apocalypse, we had to leave the desert and move our convoy of desert rangers north to the frozen wastes of Colorado. Why did we do that? Well, the desert rangers ran out of supplies and food, and up in the north a guy called the Patriarch offered to help us with that, if in return we help him to bring order back to Colorado. While he is ruling the country, his 3 children all came to hate him, and it seems like they are now each making their own preparations for overthrowing him. And we are ordered to capture them before that happens. But before we even arrive at the Patriarch, we are ending up in an ambush by another faction. And at that point we can already see some indications that fanaticism, especially a religious one, will play a big role in our new assigned area. While the normal population is also more religious than what can be healthy, the faction attacking us at the start of the game believes in God having cleansed the earth from humans by the flood first, nuclear fire second, and now there has to be another cleansing by blood.
Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb?
In a similar fanatic manner, another faction is doing human sacrifices by cutting off people's limbs and then tying them to kites to let them fly into the sky to the gods. However, the Wasteland series also never took itself completely seriously, which is why next to this topic and the brutality, there is also a rather absurd humor, which doesn't always fit that great into the game. For example, you will meet and fight a gang of clowns, you will find a rocket thrower which shoots frozen squirrels, and you can get a cannon on your vehicle which shoots ramps on your enemies. And of course, it wasn't Wasteland if there wasn't the skill for repairing toasters. Overall, I'd call the humor as somewhat more immersion breaking than in other games, including Fallout, which certainly also has its humor, but where it doesn't really manifest that much in the world itself. That said, the implementation of the story is well done. There's voice acting for all dialogues, and they did a very good job on that for the most part.
Clarence? Clarence? Ah, no! Clarence! He was 2 days away from retirement!
Furthermore, the game gives us plenty of choices in the dialogues, some of which also have skill requirements which are always shown even if not met. And with decisions we also got consequences, some smaller, while others will allow you to influence the ending of the game. The fleshed out story characters which can be recruited into the team have a very small impact though, unfortunately. Sure, of course they have some background, and you will most likely also miss some on a playthrough because you chose a different path in the dialogues with them, but once they are in your team, their overall contributions, besides of a comment here and there, aren't huge, and they rarely inject themselves into any dialogues or offer additional options. And there is the risk that they will leave your team again if they completely disagree with your decisions. That doesn't mean that they have less to say than in Wasteland 2, but they have much less influence on the game than they have in Divinity Original Sin 2, for example. In general, it's a bit weird how Wasteland 3 is handling characters, and how it indirectly promotes using custom characters over fleshed out story companions. At the start of the game we need to choose 2 characters to start with. We can either create a couple ourselves or choose from one of the pre-made couples, which do have a backstory and a few comments, but not much more, and with that they also have basically no impact on the playthrough in contrast to the characters in, again, Divinity Original 2. The reason for having to choose 2 characters is probably due to the fact that the game can be played cooperatively together with one other player. Besides of that, I can't really say much about the multiplayer mode though. After about the first hour of the game, once we reach our new base in Colorado, we can also fill up 2 additional slots of the 6 in total with custom created characters. And we can even replace the starting characters with new ones. Characters which offer to join us in the context of the story can only take up to 4 slots of that group. But of course, we won't know when these characters will join us and which skill sets they will have, which makes planning ahead quite difficult, and with the mediocre influence they have, you start to ask yourself why you should take them in the first place, which is less of a thing in games with similar mechanics. Like in other games, characters will also passively gain experience if they are not in the active team, and in Wasteland 3 also characters which are not recruited yet are increasing in level so that they match your team when they finally join. But let's get to the character system itself. Each character has a background, which provides a small bonus, and manually created characters also have a quirk, which pushes a character further into a specific direction, so that the character might have more action points, but cannot wear any armor. Besides of that, each character has 7 different attributes, like strength and intelligence, which can have a value of 1 to 10. To increase these, a character gets 1 attribute point per level. The attributes are actually rather well balanced in themselves. Sure, coordination, which provides additional action points, is likely to be the far most powerful attribute, but all characters have some use of all the other attributes. In comparison to Wasteland 2, you can also rise your attributes much quicker, and the different levels within the attributes are much more balanced, where in Wasteland 2 certain values of intelligence, for example, were basically useless until you increased them further. In addition, attributes are also retroactive now, meaning even if you increase strength later on, you will get all the hit points you missed for each level up from previous levels. While resetting the attributes isn't possible, the system feels much more polished and thought through than the one in Wasteland 2, which I found to be quite user-unfriendly and annoying. And due to that, it's also quite hard to mess up your characters completely. But besides of attributes, our characters also got skills, and the situation there is a bit more complicated. Among these are all of the weapon skills, as well as skills like Hard S, which are used in dialogues a lot, or lockpicking. For these skills you get 3 points per level up, and depending on how high your skill is already, the costs increase. But here you will really need some of the skills, and they should be increased or maxed out if possible, so that you really need to think about which character is going to do which tasks beforehand. And that makes planning with the recruitable story characters so problematic. Unless of course you are fine swapping your main characters to adapt. Based on the character's skill levels, he or she will also unlock options to learn active and passive perks, and for these the character gains 1 perk point every 2 levels starting at level 4. A nice addition, but for the most part rather unspectacular, as especially in combat only a couple of these perks are really making a difference or are actually used. And of course we also got an inventory. If you don't regularly sell unused items, you will spend more and more time on searching stuff there, and the sorting and filtering isn't the best. But besides of that, it doesn't really stand out as especially good or bad. Overall, I'd call the character system in Wasteland 3 as quite well made, and with that it's also much better than the one from the predecessor, which had quite a few serious issues, which I explained in detail in my review of that game. While the system in Wasteland 3 isn't exceptional either in any way, there also isn't much room for criticism. The only thing which really bothered me was that the way everything comes together makes it really hard to plan ahead regarding what character does what, and that this is pushing towards custom created but boring characters instead of using the ones from the story. Now, after having played through the game once, I would recommend to use the option to create the maximum of 4 custom characters, as you will have a much better time in planning with who's going to cover which skills, and you are not depending on guessing or looking up which skills new characters will bring with them, and you don't need to fear that they leave your team again. Another aspect which works significantly better than in Wasteland 2, even though it still has a couple of issues, is the combat. In a lot of games, you will stumble over the problem that you get stuck in cities for hours doing nothing but listening or reading dialogues. Regarding that, the balance in Wasteland 3 is quite good over the total playtime, but within the first 10 hours after the initial tutorial, you can get the impression that combat is just playing a very minor role in the game and is just mixed in here and there. This does change in favor of combat though, and with that the overall distribution gets quite okay. But how does the combat system itself work? Depending on the situation, combat starts in a somewhat different way. If we fire the first shot, then we will also get the first turn for the rest of our team. If we are, however, spotted by the enemies, they will start off and we only have a chance of taking turns with very few characters depending on their initiative. If the combat starts out of a dialogue, which actually happens relatively often, it can go either way. But let's assume the normal case, which is that we can initiate the combat ourselves. As first step, we will bring our characters into position in real time and fire the first shot. Movement in real time can already become a nuisance as the whole sneaking mechanic works rather badly. If the distance between character and enemy gets too small, then a visibility bar for that character is filling up, depending on the character's sneaking stat. And once it's filled up, the enemy will start the fight and you will probably reload. But if we positioned one character first and then swapped over to do the same with a different one, then reacting on the first character's discovery gets pretty impossible in most cases. It's also not really helpful that the controls for the whole group aren't really suited for combat, as the characters move one after another, meaning that the last character then moves with a very big delay. But if everything works well, we fire the first shot, the combat starts and we got the first turn for all our characters. Depending on the coordination attribute, each character has an according amount of action points, and depending on the speed attributes, these can be used for moving an according distance. So for a gunslinger, the first action in combat is likely to move to some cover which is closer to the enemy. Cover does not just reduce the enemy's hit chance, but also increases the own one. The weapon then determines how many action points we need to fire the gun. There are actually 2 slots for equipped weapons and multiple quick slots for things like grenades, but you can freely swap around stuff in these slots even during combat. Using items, however, does use up action points, of course. There's also a kind of combo bar, which is a somewhat exotic mechanic here. This bar fills up on every shot depending on your charisma value for whatever reason. And once it's filled up, you can do an aimed shot with a hit chance of 95%, which can be used to aim for specific body parts, resulting in debuffs, more damage and sometimes special effects. When a character runs out of action points to do anything useful, but still got some points left, these can be used to do one of 3 things. The points can be used to set up an ambush, allowing the character to automatically shoot at incoming enemies in their turn, which does require enough points to shoot though. They can also be used to increase the defensive values, and lastly, up to 2 points can be taken over into the next turn. And especially because of this last option, combined with the bigger need for positioning and the increased availability of attribute points to max out your action points, the combat is much more dynamic than it was in Wasteland 2, where you had to make sure you have exactly 10 action points if you had a weapon which required 5 points to shoot. As with 9 points, you could only shoot once and basically wasted 4 action points every turn. But even though the combat works much better in Wasteland 3, that doesn't mean there aren't any problems here. While you can pick up downed characters a couple of times within combat and without limits outside of combat, that is not the case for computer-controlled companions. These are mostly pets which you can find somewhere and then join your party, like a cat called Major Tom pretty much at the start of the game. And there are quite a lot of those. Most of the time you will run around with 5 or more of these pets, which in itself is already a bit annoying. Personally, I'm generally not a fan of having a whole zoo around you, but the issue that you cannot resurrect them is often made worse by the AI, which is pretty bad in general, also including the enemies. Often they don't react at all, and of course they also don't run away when hit points are low. In addition, you kind of depend on your pets, as the balance of damage and hit points is somewhat off. Most of the time, your vehicle, which is used to drive from location to location, can be upgraded and which can also be used in some fights, as well as your own characters die after pretty much 2 enemy attacks, while your pets can endure much more damage. Of course, it would be even more fatal if they also drop dead after just 2 shots, but even like this, the situation is far from optimal. Additional problems can be found in the active abilities you can use during combats. Most of them aren't really super useful, and the one ability which you use all the time doesn't work pretty much half of the time, so that it does eat up the action points, but has no effect. This is an issue which will basically annoy you in every other battle. Another weirdness specific to Wasteland 3 is doors which you cannot look through even when they are open, unless you got some character on the other side. While you can attack characters in the other room, they are not displayed and you have to aim at empty tiles. As mentioned, you also got a vehicle with you, which you can use in some of the fights, especially on ambushes on the world map. While you can try to shoot all the enemies with your characters, you can also just use your vehicle instead to run them down, which is just so much faster and can shorten the combat by several turns, which leaves a very weird aftertaste. Well, besides of the fact that this also leaves weird and apparently meaningless symbols on your characters which evaded your vehicle. The balancing of the difficulty level through the duration of the game doesn't make too much sense either. Combat in the first third of the game is significantly more difficult than in the last third, where the game concludes with extremely trivial battles, which are still easy even if you don't show up with your full group anymore, if you relied too much on your story characters staying in the group at the end of the game. But in spite of all these problems, the combat is fun most of the time, and in terms of game mechanics it works better than it did in the release version of Wasteland 2. You should just not expect anything sophisticated and balanced here, and you need to get used to the rough edges of this system. Talking about rough edges, I can also mention a couple of other bugs I stumbled upon. The most obvious one is probably that one of my characters had no animations and was just sliding through the world, pretty much all the time. Besides of that, you can also crouch down to get some light bonuses. If you then save and load the game, all characters are standing again, but they keep the crouch bonuses even if you start running around now. At one point I wanted to hack a turret which was already destroyed, which caused me getting stuck in that computer I hacked. So I had to shut down and restart the game. And in another quest I had to loot an item from an object which didn't appear in the world, so there was no way to click on it. Luckily, there was another solution to that quest. So there isn't really anything which breaks the whole game or is terribly annoying, but there's still some stuff to be ironed out. Besides of that, the game had no game stoppers and was very stable for the most part. There was just one battle where the game crashed and hung up a couple of times. In addition, I had to set the game into real full screen mode as it was stuttering otherwise. And regarding displaying stuff, there had been quite a development since the second part of the series, which looked quite rough and where inXile actually bought some Unity assets from the store to save some money. While in Wasteland 2 we moved around the world map as a symbol depicting a Desert Ranger star, we are now using a real tank-like car for chugging around icy Colorado, which isn't super detailed either, but is somewhat nicer to look at. And while we are on the map, we will also get various different and sometimes very absurd radio messages, like the Patriarch doing some recruiting for his marshals, a short episode of a radio play, some messages in Russian, or just random insanities by some psychos.
I carved little handles for my razors from animal bones I'd collected, perfecting a beautiful set of hundreds of tiny, unique, lovingly crafted knives.
There's also music, which fits very well onto this scenario. I already mentioned that religion plays a major role in the whole setting of Wasteland 3. And that also reflects on the music. Besides of the usual atmospheric soundtracks, there are also some fitting locations where you will hear some nicely done versions of Christian songs, which make these situations even more bizarre.
Dorsey's vengeance is coming! Like in Hotlanders!
Laying down some cover.
The zones you can visit in the game are also visually well designed and, similarly to dialogues, often offer multiple options to proceed, so that you got something like the typical choice of either hack the computer to open the door or lockpick the door directly. As a small additional reward for exploring the relatively small zones thoroughly, you can also find some creepy dolls which will give your team some small bonuses. And while the frequency of the NPCs repeating their one-liners when you get close by is much too high, it's generally pretty cool how often NPCs react to your accomplishments.
Buchanan not to blame for Aspen's slaughter. Patriarch calls son misguided.
And with that, we are almost finished with the review. All that remains is the conclusion. Wasteland 3 offers quite an interesting and for the most part well-made story with a lot of choices and consequences. And this is all happening in a very atmospheric environment as long as you can look past the humor and also the zoo which you carry around with you. And if you are okay with quite some criticism aimed at religion. The character system is working quite well this time, which is a big improvement over the predecessor. However, there's still a problem regarding how well you can plan ahead, and the push towards custom created characters in general isn't great either. The combat would have really profited from some more polish, even when it's already working better than it did in Wasteland 2. And with that, Wasteland 3 surpasses Wasteland 2 in terms of mechanics and production values, but in total it's still somewhat away from being a perfect game. While this is a really close one, my rating for Wasteland 3 is a reluctant but still full thumbs up. I think it's a worthy next part of the Wasteland series and I can recommend it to most fans of RPGs. That is, as long as you aren't totally opposed to what I mentioned regarding the story and setting, and you don't focus too much on the combat aspects, and it also does help if you prefer creating custom characters over taking story-created characters anyways. And of course you would also need to either have the Xbox Game Pass Ultimate, which includes this game, or €60 or dollars for the full price on Steam. So it might be a good idea to wait for a sale here. And with that, I hope I've been able to give you a good overview of the game. If that's the case, I'd welcome a thumbs up for this review, and if you're interested in more reviews, previews and let's plays, probably mostly of indie titles, then please subscribe to this channel to not miss any new content. An overview of all games I've ever played can also be found on my website at ndnw.net. Just be aware that while the site itself is English, most of the videos it's linking to are in German. And that's it from me again. I say goodbye and will take my toaster for a walk. It's already wagging excitedly. You want to go outside, little fella? Yeah, well then, let's go. Farewell and until next time.